The Bible in the 21st century. We're looking at what the Bible teaches about various themes, and the theme of this presentation, or set of three presentations, relates to leadership. Leadership in the church. What does the Bible have to say? What guidance can it offer us in relation to leadership in the church? First of all, we have a problem with that word. Words convey meaning, and when that word is said, probably the picture that is conjured up in your mind, pictures like that. Churches are buildings. That's a problem word because it's misunderstood in today's language. In the original language of the New Testament, there are things that word, the word church, that we translate as church, that it simply cannot mean. The word cannot mean a building. That's not its use in the original language. It's an ordinary word. It cannot mean a religious system. That's not the way the word was used. It cannot mean a religious organization which you join with a membership. It cannot mean that in the original language. It cannot mean clergy. It does not carry that meaning at all. People talk about entering the church, then they become a clergyman or a clergywoman. And it certainly cannot mean hierarchy, where people lead from a position of authority. The original word cannot carry any of these ideas and meanings, and the problem is we've got to strip that out of our minds when we think about leadership in the church, because that's what it means. It's an ordinary word, and the ordinary word was used of a gathering of competent adults, competent citizens. That's the normal use of the word. So when it's used in a spiritual sense, in a Christian sense, it means a gathering, a local group of the followers of Jesus. That's what the word means, and that's the only meaning it can carry in the original language. It's not a religious system, not an organization, not a building, not built around clergy. It's just the local group of the followers of Jesus. Now, with that in mind, we've got to scrub out pictures of buildings, organization, memberships, clergy. Let's focus on how the New Testament used the word, because it used it consistent with the meaning of the word in the original language. Local communities of the followers of Jesus. Now, these communities existed all over the Middle East, Turkey, Greece, Italy, and fringing out beyond that in the first few centuries. There were no buildings called churches. They met in each other's homes, they met in marketplaces, they met where they could gather together, where the climate was good they could meet outside. It's people, communities. And the Bible offers no logical set of rules about leadership. And if you look at the history of the early church, you cannot discern any logical set of rules about leadership in terms of structures. If the Bible had taught that, immediately the Bible would have been dated, because the structures that would work in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries and so on wouldn't work in the very different societies we have today. No, what the Bible presents is principles. They're clear principles, and we have got to interpret them into the culture and lifestyles of modern day living in the 21st century, and that will vary somewhat from culture to culture and situation to situation. So perhaps it's better to look at not leadership in the church because of that misleading word church, but talk about leading God's people. That's the focus of the New Testament. That's the focus of what Jesus said and taught. Let's make that our focus in this series of presentations. And I've slipped in the word among, because leadership's not above. It's not top down. Comes from within. Now, it's a pressing problem today in the modern day church in the West. Interestingly, it's much less of a problem in the very rapidly growing church in many of the countries, most of the countries throughout the world today, outside the West. They don't face these problems because very often they're under persecution, and the persecution, in a strange way, makes the problems we have in the West not possible there. In many countries they cannot possess a building, it's illegal. People in formal leadership positions end up being arrested and locked up. So it's a very different position in many countries in the world today. But let's focus on the West, where it is a problem. There are basic questions. Now, in this series of 3 presentations, I'm not going to give you black and white answers to these, because what I'm going to do is to lay out the principles and invite you in your groups to talk and discuss it through. How do the principles apply today? Many churches today are hierarchical, and you can get promoted from one level of clergy to the next. But large number of churches throughout the world today are led at a congregational level, but there's often some sort of super congregational link-ups between the churches. Where does that word bishop fit? It's in the traditional churches, but it barely exists at all in the vast majority of churches throughout the world today. It's caused a problem down through the centuries. Jesus taught, Paul emphasized the total equality between men and women. How does it fit? In the end of the day, how do we take decisions? What's the basis of it? How do we move forward together? Where do priests fit? Again, 1 or 2 of the hierarchical churches have a priesthood. It can vary enormously in how it's seen. But in most church denominations today, there is no priesthood. Where does it fit? And what kind of qualities do we need for leadership? Is there any set of criteria laid down for us? What qualifies a person to be a leader? And that tragic problem today, doesn't matter what the church is, there is a division between clergy and laity. In some of the churches at congregational level, there's a kind of pretense that there's no division, but in the end of the day, the clergy take the decisions. There is a division. Somebody is formally trained, the rest are not. And there is a division. How do we deal with that today? We're going to look at principles that underpin these. Principles of leadership. The details we have to interpret into the specific culture of our own country, situation, and the 21st century. The first thing is that Jesus rejected the rule book mentality of his day. Religion in the days of Jesus, and tragically still today, works by a rule book mentality. This is right, that's wrong, do this, do that, you must perform this ritual in this way, at this time, in this way, done by this person. Jesus rejected that. And if you look at Matthew 5, 6 and 7, where Matthew's collated some of the teaching of Jesus, it's very clear. That's what he presented. You see, he lifted it all to a much higher level. He looked at lifestyle. How do we live as part of the kingdom of God? What kind of lifestyle does Jesus want to take us forward into? And once we get a picture of lifestyle, motives, priorities, agendas, then it lifts it away above any rule book mentality. Rules are imposed. Lifestyle comes from within. And again, if you look at it, the way he described in the kingdom is utterly radical. It was a radical in his days. It's still radical today. Cuts right across societies of all sorts, shapes and types. It's a different quality of living. Because that's what Jesus wants to do for us all. Hang on to that picture. Let it encourage you. Whatever potential rests in you, and we all have potential within us, enormous potential, because God made us with that. Jesus wants to release us, each and every individual one of us, to our full potential. Life to the full. Life with a capital L, as one person once said. A higher quality of lifestyle and living. Radical, liberating, fulfilling. That's the way that Jesus leads. That's what he wants to do. And it's no different for the people of God today. Now, the evidence we're going to look at in these three presentations comes from two, and they're kind of overlapping, two kinds of evidence. We're going to start by looking at the example and the teaching of Jesus. There's no better place to start. He set everything in motion. He makes it all possible. Then we're going to look at the wider New Testament as it worked out in practice in little communities of the followers of Jesus who met in each other's homes mainly, sometimes in borrowed premises, sometimes outside. And we'll look at the direction that they went in when it came to leadership. And from that we can deduce principles. Then we interpret them into our modern day situation and work them through. How did Jesus lead? Well, let's look at it negatively first of all. He didn't do that. Go throughout all the gospel stories, you won't see him setting up a set of rules. Do this, do that, do the other. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. You must attend here, you must wear this, you must perform that. This ritual's important. He never did that. He never used fear. He never frightened people into the kingdom of heaven. He invited them in warmly. He never frightened people. You've got to keep these rules, otherwise God will be angry and send you to hell. He never did that. Never ever. You'll never find that. And he never ordered people around. Now we've got to stop and think for a moment. Too much ordering people around in our societies in general today. And tragically you see it in religion, and you see it in churches. There's a given way of doing things. You must do it this way. And very often I must do it because I'm qualified. I'm a clergyman or clergywoman. Never did that. Not his way. Positively. He showed leadership by showing leadership. He was the greatest leader of all time. He had a clear sense of direction. And it showed in his positive, affirmative way he went forward. He led by example. Yes, he gave some teaching. He directed, he encouraged, he supported. He wanted to release the potential. He wanted to release the potential of his early followers, that group of 12 men. And there were others attached round the edge. If you look at these, that group, they were a right motley crew. Would we have chosen such people? Probably not. They'd never have gotten near church leadership. But Jesus saw the potential in them and he wanted to release them. And history shows that he did release the potential, and they all went on to make an impact in later life, positively. But he gave that picture. That is true leadership, and we're going to unpack that in a moment or two. Servanthood. That was utterly radical in the days of Jesus. Never been seen before. Yes, Isaiah had grasped it in his prophecies centuries before, but the people hadn't understood what Isaiah was saying. Jesus fulfilled completely the picture that Isaiah had brought. The servant king. A paradox. Jesus led by servanthood. Whatever else is true in everything Jesus said and did, and indeed everything in the New Testament, leadership is never ever presented in terms of ranks, positions, or appointments. It's seen in terms of roles, things to be done, people who needed help, serving others. A different thought form, a different way of looking at it, because that was the goal. That was what was the goal of Jesus. His time on this planet was very limited. He died a very young man, resurrected, returned to the throne room of heaven. He left behind a motley crew of followers, and yet in them he left his power, his authority, and he left them the principles of leadership. They turned the world upside down over the centuries. Because leadership seeks to release others. That's its only purpose. And when others are released, there's a great joy in it. A great joy when we see others doing things better than we can do them. Now that's true leadership. Joy in the success of others. Not any leader holding the front position, the platform, the authority, but a leadership that releases others and find fulfillment when others do it better than the leader can do it. You can see there are kind of two alternatives. On the left, there's a kind of picture that's very common in societies today. Power over others. We may cover it up and say, well, we're doing it for their benefit. They may or may not appreciate that. But at the end of the day, we're competing for power. And indeed, tragically, within the church, promotion, hierarchy, more powerful positions. The other alternative, which was the way of Jesus. I don't mean competing in a horrible way at all, but our goal is always, what can I do to release others, to allow them to move forward, to release the greatness that's within them, greatness that may be far greater than any greatness I'll ever reach. You see, it's really basically that. God so loved the world that he gave. He wanted to release humanity in every sense. Love means our agenda is seeking the best for the other, not ourselves. It's not giving us a warm emotional feeling. That's not what the word means. It's action. The best for the other. Now let's look specifically at the teaching of Jesus. As time went on, the disciples realized that they were in the presence of greatness in Jesus. They didn't fully understand it. But they realized, well, we're in contact with this wonderful and remarkable person. and they started to see themselves getting a kind of rubbing off glory, and they started to compete for power and influence. Came to a head one day. Two of the disciples wanted the top places, and the others were not pleased. You see, the disciples, indeed everybody at that time, they only had two models of leadership in their experience. This is all they had to fall back on. They saw the Jewish religious leadership. They were all Jews. In essence, it's built around hierarchical kinds of structures. Sometimes you were born into it. Sometimes by getting under the right teacher, you worked your way up till you became powerful. In both cases, you could order people around, and you tended to look down on the rabble who were not part of the religious leadership structure. They were inferior. You'd studied. You'd been appointed. You had an official status. But the other kind of leadership was the kind of leadership that they saw in the Roman Empire, which ran the whole area. And that was simply authoritarian, sometimes brutally authoritarian. Stemmed right from the emperor down. You did what you were told. You didn't argue, because if you argued, the consequences, well, they could be fatal. Now that's the only two pictures they had in life. How were they going to see leadership with Jesus? Well, when they had that little tussle, Jesus brought them together. He took it head on and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles, that's the non-Jews, mainly the Roman authorities, lord over them, authoritarian. Their high officials exercise authority over them. You do it this way, and if you don't, you'll face the consequences. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The impact of that little short teaching, it escapes us today. The word is translated there servant. That's what the word means. You serve others simply because of their needs. You're not paid to do it. You're not forced to do it. And you don't expect any reward for doing it. You see a need. You do what you can to help the need. Jesus introduced that idea. It's radical. It cuts right across the religious systems of the day, right across the political systems of the day. But the other word is even more dramatic. Now look at what Jesus said. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Stop for a minute. Slave? The Roman Empire ran on slavery. And a slave had no rights whatsoever. They did what their master demanded, when their master demanded, in the way their master demanded. Now that's a mindset for leadership amongst God's people. No rights whatsoever. That must have jolted the early disciples, rocked them back. And it should jolt us today. Leadership is servanthood. It's a totally different ballpark from leadership as is conceptualized throughout modern day societies, and tragically, the kind of leadership we sometimes see in churches today. You see, it's totally different. Now we're going to go down the road of leadership and say leading God's people. We've got to get into the mindset of Jesus. Leadership is totally different. Try and strip out of your mind the conventional models of leadership that you see in wider society, perhaps you see in your own workplace, and in some church groups today. Not them all, fortunately. It's radical. It's different. The example of Jesus, we're familiar with this story. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and they returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. The example. But the word translated servant there is the slave. Because the convention of the customs then was that when you went to visit someone's house, their slave washed your feet. They didn't have shoes like we have today. They had kind of open leather sandals. All the dust and all the mess that they walked through would catch in their feet. It's their welcome. But a slave did it. The master would click his fingers and the slave would do it. None of the disciples were prepared to wash each other's feet as they went into that upper room. Jesus did it. There were no slaves there to do it. He did it. What an example. Leadership is servanthood. You see, human thinking goes kind of this way. We like our structures. So leadership is kind of authoritarian. It's top down. There are ranks. Your status and position in the rank as chains of command. If you think that's a common way of leadership in Western society today. It's typical of the way things are done. But that's what it can so often lead to. We want to move up the leadership ranks to gain greater power. Jesus' thinking cuts right across that. Because he came to bring God's kingdom. That's the central thing, not church, God's kingdom. And in God's kingdom, leadership is servanthood. We lead to serve each other, doing the most menial things if necessary. There are no ranks, there's no hierarchy. You see, we're all equal and our status rests in our security in Jesus. He died for everyone. It doesn't matter who they are, what their age is, what their background or experience are, what their education is. We're all one in Christ, equal. There are no chains of command in the kingdom. And it comes back to that. We compete to serve the needs of others. Leadership, if you like, is in it for the benefit of the led, not for what we can gain in terms of status and position and power. And that can be very subtle. A bit later on he brought it together when he said that you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. The word there could be brothers and sisters. Do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father and he's in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That is probably one of the most ignored passages in the entire teaching of Jesus. We pay lip service to it, we explain it away. We have to understand it in the context of the religious leadership of the day of Jesus. He was getting near the end of his earthly time, and he was preparing his followers for what would lie ahead. And leadership would be part of that. You see, the leadership in the Pharisee sense then was a bit like this. And that's what they would have experienced. They'd analysed life in detail. They'd reduced it to a set of rules. In fact, they'd reduced it to over 600 rules. And they thought God would be pleased if they kept all the rules. That's not what Jesus does, and it's a wrong view of God. You see it in a lot of religions today. Then the leaders have to impose the rules on the led. You see a lot of that in religion today. And all these rules and the practices that derive from them were designed to generate approval from others. They were at the front. They were in the public places. They were ostentatious. You see a lot of that in religions today. And those who were the leaders, who were qualified, they were superior. And they expected superior treatment. And they looked down on the rest, the rabble, the laity. And that generates religious elitism. You see a lot of that in religions today. And they expected to be recognized. They wanted their titles, their social status. They wanted people just to bow their head and nod to them and have respect. Social superiority. And that's all over religion today as well. Jesus was speaking against that background. Now let's go back to the passage. Back to that word, the radical idea, serving others simply because of their needs. And he speaks about the greatest among you will be your servant. That's a different kind of leadership thought form. Three things were not to be called. And you may find this uncomfortable. The Jewish teachers, they wanted that title. Gave them respect, gave them status. They were above the rabble. The idea of the father. Basically, it led to someone who's socially or spiritually superior. Having a head full of Bible knowledge does not make you spiritually superior. Being appointed to some position of leadership does not make you spiritually superior. And you should never expect people to call you a title which indicates that they regard you as spiritually superior. Uncomfortable, but that's what Jesus taught. Now the word there is difficult to translate. It really carries the idea of a leader, and different Bible versions will translate it in different ways. Nor are you to be called the leader. People are appointed to be the leader of a church. That cuts against what Jesus was saying. Jesus is the leader of the church. We're all together there to support and help each other as part of that local group of the community of the followers of Jesus. That command also makes us feel uncomfortable. Oh, it's worth reading that passage and pondering it and praying it through again and again. We should take seriously what Jesus said and what he meant. Fundamental principle. Absolutely fundamental. Somehow in the West we've got it wrong, and we've got to go back out to the countries and the rest of the world where they very often have got it far more right than we have. And their churches are growing and people are coming into the kingdom all the time. Yes, they're being persecuted often. And it's the very persecution that stops them having the leadership structures that we have developed in the West. And they prosper and grow despite the terrible conditions they're working under. We've so much to learn from such wonderful people. Now, with that thought in mind, we're going to finish part 1. This has looked at the teaching of Jesus specifically. Now, our next part, we're going to widen that to bring that into the context of the New Testament as a whole.